Welcome to a presentation on engagement, regulation, and protection, institutional responses to student activism in the United States and United Kingdom by Chris Castro, Darrell Dees Jr., Chris Green, and Michaela Schimberger.
A 2015 survey of over 140,000 incoming first-year American students found that 1 in 10 of those students expected to participate in a protest during their time at their institution. With the number of students engaging in protests, demonstrations, sit-ins on the rise, institutions have one major question. How do they engage, regulate, and support the student activism occurring on their campuses? To tackle this question, we will be looking at the following topics, broken down to encourage understanding at a deeper level beyond just the institution.
First things first, it is important to try and understand what motivates people to protest or engage in social activism. In other words, why do people protest? At the base of it all lays grievances. Whether it is a supervisor who suddenly employs a rule that will negatively and permanently impact your workload, or if a student receives a bad grade for an assignment and discovers the grading criteria used was not what was provided to the class, grievances are a part of everyday life. But when circumstances impact an individual's life on a large scale and comes to find out the situation is having the same impact on the surrounding people, this is where things get interesting. People with shared grievances are more likely to mobilize and engage in protests, but this is only the beginning to understanding why. Before describing some of the different motivators for protests, it is beneficial to understand the idea of collective action frames, which are described as action-oriented sets of beliefs and meanings that inspire and legitimate the activities and campaigns of a social movement organization, according to sociologists Robert Binford and David Snow. The active participants, or movement actors as they are called, play a critical role in producing and maintaining the meaning of the movement not only for themselves, but for any constituents, antagonists, and other outsiders. Framing is a process of meaning-making, and groups who organize are constantly tasked with the responsibility to define what it is they stand for or are working against. If the group is successful in their framing, then their group's work will be understood and defined consistently, whether outsiders agree with their work or not. Framing should be continual, especially as the group increases in size. Groups should be aware of how individuals define the movement and ensure that there is a general consensus, allowing the group to move in solidarity with one another. All collective frames are not the same and vary from group to group dependent on the different features and degree to which they apply to the group. These features include the particular issues addressed, the movement's flexibility or rigidity in the amount of ideas covered, variation in the interpretive scope, and the movement's resonance or mobilizing potency. Now that we know the importance of framing in social movements, we should look at the different paradigms that explain some common motivations for protesting. The first is grievances, which we discussed earlier. These are the feelings of relative deprivation when comparing one's own situation to a standard. The next paradigm is efficacy. This is the actual belief and expectation that protests can alter conditions and policies. In this frame, the benefits of protesting outweigh the costs, making it a viable and plausible option. Number 3 is identity. Having a connection to and an alignment with a group of people makes it more likely that an individual will protest on behalf of the group. Number 4, emotions. Emotions have the ability to accelerate a cause and amplify it. Group-based anger, for example, is commonly explored when trying to understand protesting and other social activist behaviors. It is important to note that the credibility and exploration of the role of emotions has changed over time, from being seen as a negative and irrational behavior to being altogether ignored, to today serving as a real and valid reason for why protests can occur. The last one is social embeddedness. This paradigm zeroes in on the aspect of social capital. If someone is a part of a collective organization, there is potential for a high exposure to politics and potentially an expectation to participate in them. The final piece to understanding protest participation is mobilization. Mobilization is the action of protest, and it is necessary for protest to occur. It occurs in steps. The first part is consensus mobilization, which is the final shared understanding in the group about who should act, why, and how. The second part is action mobilization. This step occurs after the consensus is achieved. Be mindful that social activism is continually evolving, especially with the advancements of technology and social media. This technology adds to the tool belt of resources for successful social movements, with their capacities for allocating resources, assigning roles, and adapting tactics and strategy in response to events.
Now that we've taken a look at the psychological reasonings for why a student might participate in activism, let's dive into historical reasons that students in the United States and the United Kingdom have participated in activism on their college and university campuses. Student activism has a very rich history in American higher education, dating back to the colonial colleges where a lot of students protested for dissatisfaction in the way that their institutions treated them with rules and regulations. Student activism continued in the 19th and 20th century, shifting away from dissatisfaction with institutional treatment and focusing more on broader social issues, especially in the 1960s with the rise of the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, Women's Liberation Movement, and anti-militarism. Building off that tradition, student activism continues on American college campuses today with a huge focus on raising awareness and making change for issues of social justice and social injustice. Although student activism has a rich history in American higher education, in the United Kingdom, student activism did not play a large part in their higher education system until about the 1960s with those large global issues like the Vietnam War and women's liberation. The United Kingdom saw a large spike in student activism in 2010 with a large number of students gathering to occupy spaces in protest of the very high tuition increase of about 300%. Student activism continues today in the United Kingdom, often run through student unions, which are groups of students similar to American student governments that fight for the rights of students on college and university campuses. The goal of student activism in higher education in both of these countries has varied depending on the causes for which students organize and the socio-political context of the time period. However, student activism remains a way for students on college and university campuses to raise their voice and advocate for change.
So back to the original research question. How do institutions engage, regulate, and support student activism on their campuses? At each institution, we ask the professionals the same question. How does your school engage, regulate, and support student activism on its campus? From many of these professionals, we got the same feedback about our question. We were repeatedly told to remove the word regulate from our research question, as most professionals felt this did not encompass the true intention behind their engagement with their student activists. We found this fascinating because all institutions have policies regarding student gathering and student media regulation. Through our interviews and our research, we found 4 key themes. Preparation is key. The goal is to empower, power to the people, and policies and regulation. I think that Dr. Welch at the University of Central Florida said it best when he said, the key to success in the bad times is the things that we do and the foundation we build in the good times. Students want their voices to be heard. That's a key component of the empowerment that we as professionals need to give them. The professional staff at Rollins College provided a great list of ways to empower students. First, discuss their end goals. What do they want to achieve? Discuss concerns those the institution might have and those the students might have. Turn moments of pain into moments of education and help them channel their energy to best achieve their goals. Across the pond in England, there's something similar to a student government association, that of the student unions. Every university has one, and the institution recognizes the power and sway these students have in their positions. These student unions banded together to boycott a national student survey in which they thought the results might influence a raise in tuition rates. Institutions were faced with a choice. Do we push our students to take this survey, or do they not? And in most cases, the institutions we visited did not push their students to participate. An official from Goldsmith said it best when he said, "The student unions are at the core of who we are and what we do, and the students we serve." As such, going against them wouldn't look too good on behalf of the institution. Even though professionals pushed against the term regulate within our research question, every institution has rules and regulations to ensure the safety and well-being of the students on that campus, as well as the professional staff.
Next, we will discuss how to move forward. As mentioned earlier, in supporting, engaging, and regulating student activism, there are ways in which we can and should interact with our students through these different endeavors. Those include challenging ourselves and our colleagues, staying up to date with government changes, proper civic education to our students, and educating students on institutional policies. As student affairs professionals, we challenge ourselves and colleagues to increase commitment to the development of our students. We stay up to date with what is happening in the world to understand and prepare for how they may impact our students and campus life. Randall from the National Association of Scholars stated how civics education in America should teach the history, the ideals, and the structure of government of the United States. Civic education should, in the first instance, aim to create active citizens who have affection for their country as well as knowledge of how its public institutions work. According to Samantha Raffleson, Illinois, Tennessee, Colorado, and Arizona have passed or introduced legislation designed to require public universities to remain neutral on political issues, prevent them from disinviting speakers, and impose penalties for students and others who interfere with these speakers, just proving knowledge of institutional policies is important. In closing, I must ask, how do you plan on supporting, engaging, and regulating student activism on your campus? And who has a seat at that decision-making table?